Hello, everybody, and welcome to another episode of Office Hours. Hello, hi, welcome. Come on in and sit on down. It's episode 76. Episode 76, like many episodes before it, will function as follows. We're going to listen to some questions, and I'm going to answer them. We're going to do 3 of them. So if you have a question about game mastering, about tabletop RPGs, the more specific, the better. Go ahead and go to my website, www.adam-koble.com. There's a little office hours link there. Ooh, you get that? You hear that in my little teenage voice? Oh, there's an office hours link. Just click on it. Just click on the office hours link. Fill out the form. You can record your voice. If you don't want to, you don't feel comfortable, you're just like, no, Adam, I'm not doing it. Get someone else to do it for you. Or just write in the question, Adam, I didn't feel comfortable recording my voice, and I'll just read your question. It's okay. Maybe you don't feel like doing that, and I'm all right with that. I am all right with that. However, today, Ian, JC, and Tyler have all submitted questions for my answering. So we're gonna hang out. We're gonna answer some questions. We're gonna do them in the order of longest to shortest. So our first question comes to us from Ian.
Hi Adam. First of all, I am a massive fan of your work on Roll20 roleplay as well as Office Hours. You've inspired me to take up GMing again after a very extended holiday from it. So when I was looking for something to GM, I decided that award-winning role-playing game Dungeon World is what I would choose. It's both old school and nice and refreshing. However, I find myself struggling a bit with some of the concepts. Now I will blame my now more mature and adult brain, but I don't quite get fronts and the asking of players questions side of it. I get the why, so you collaboratively build the world together, which is cool, but it's more of a how issue. Having come from the world of Call of Cthulhu, Wolfrup, Vampire the Masquerade, and Shadowrun, I'm used to prepping everything in advance. I guess where I'm struggling is with where and when do I ask questions? Is there a specific place? If I want to set the group up for playing in a Conan-esque city with the Tower of the Large Grey Mammal, do I ask them questions like, where in the city of the Large Grey Mammal did you learn your magic wizard? And when we have done the first session, I'm not sure where I should ask players questions to help them build the rest of the world for us to adventure into. Which takes us to the fronts part, which I kind of get and kind of don't. So I was hoping you could take my example of the Tower of the Large Grey Mammal and maybe help me understand what I'm missing in terms of what do all the components do, or trying to help somebody with an old school approach to DMing who has been brainwashed for years to understand a better way of doing something. Anyway, thank you in advance for any help, and I appreciate all your advice so far.
Well, Ian, I would start, I think, by saying that I don't necessarily think that Dungeon World's kind of core stuff is inherently better than a more traditional approach to GM prep. I think that when we think about the sort of lonely fun of a traditional Dungeons and Dragons GM or Game Master, Dungeon Master, whatever, Shadowrun, Shadow Master, whatever your game calls it. But when we think about a traditional style of GM prep, we do think about, I've drawn the map, I've created all the NPCs, I have decided the magic system, I have built the world, I've named the oceans, I have drawn the mountains up from the land, and I've got a full understanding, an almanac-style understanding of both the world at large and the places that the characters are going to go, so that no matter what the players ask me, I am ready to answer them. And to be fair, that is how our forefathers did create yon Dungeons and Dragons, right? Like, this is how things like RuneQuest, D&D, all of the D&D settings, minigames that emulate it, Vampire, Shadowrun, as you mentioned, this is kind of how they function, right? This is the model that we emulated, where you could basically go to the store, go to your game store or your mail order catalog, and you could get yourself a pre-generated adventure. And the pre-generated adventure was a pamphlet, or in later days, softcover or hardcover book that would contain everything that you would normally have done yourself as the GM. It's all of the prep you would have normally felt obligated to do. So this way, when your players say, what is the annual rainfall in the Snake Weather Basin? You could say, well, according to the table on page 18, in the month of Flame Scale, the Snake Weather Basin receives 6 to 12 cromblums of rain. What is a cromblum, you might ask? Well, a cromblum is like your inches, only slightly larger. It's 1.5 inches to a cromblum. And these are the kinds of pieces of information that a campaign setting would record because they wanted to provide the GM with an immersive experience for their players, right? They wanted to give you all of the tools that you needed, which is to say a lot of stuff to memorize, so you could pass that along to your players when they ask those questions, so they could feel like you were the one that understood the world, that you were giving them factual and fictional information that they could rely on. So as game masters, as dungeon masters, we would often look at these modules, look at these campaign settings and say, well, I should probably start by determining the rule of measure in this game, right? I should probably understand, well, let's see, how do they measure things? Well, they measure things by an elf's foot. That is the base measure. So you're 10 elf's feet tall. And so, there's this idea that we have to create detail so that we can be immersed. What happened as time went on is that games started to think that there might be other ways in which we could build setting. Some of them codified these things. Some of them gave you tools or tables, right? Sort of the first things that we got, and this goes back as far as Traveler. The first kind of things that we got to create a sandbox environment, or at least give the GM tools to generate their own environment in advance and not decide everything, were random tables. So you could say, all right, in this environment, there is a role. It's a settlement, and it's a settlement of medium size, and it has 5 temples. And so you could create this stuff, whether you're doing a dungeon, right? The Dungeon Master's Guide for AD&D has this random dungeon generator. There are random setting generators. These are kind of the first step away from, well, just make it up yourself. Like, just learn how a global economic and socio-political system works, and then build a society after determining the geography of the location. Like, it's a lot. It's a lot of work, and it's not for everybody. Now, this doesn't mean that as we've moved for some games away from that towards a more improvised or sort of seat of your pants style of prep, it doesn't mean that this old school style, this original style, is invalid anymore. It's just that I think that a lot of people realize as they do this GM prep that it is time and energy intensive, that it can lead you to hours and hours of poring over maps and territories and cultures and building your own deep world, which I think a lot of people romanticize, right? World building is this thing that you see people like Patrick Rothfuss or George R.R. Martin being lauded for. These are the kinds of things that people will pay a great deal of money to listen to an author talk about their world building. We get into things like, how do you create an authentic magic system for your... fuck all of that. I hate that shit. I hate the deification of people who do that. I'm just... oh boy, it's not for me. I have neither the time nor the inclination. What I prefer to do, and this is again, for me, I like to look at what is around the players and build out from there. And I think part of what really appeals to me about the Apocalypse engine, many of its games, Apocalypse World and Dungeon World at the very least, is that ability to drop a pin in the world and watch the ripples spread. Now, we're coming up on 100 episodes of Court of Swords now, and I GM, and I'm going to put my mug down and do big sarcastic quotation marks here, so if you're just listening, world building. I do world building by pin drop, right? And I've been doing this from the beginning, and I am not the only one dropping pins. So what I mean by that is dropping a pin on the map is, and watching the ripples, is saying, I care only about this one needle sharp thing. I only care about this town, this city, this person in this setting, right? So if I say, I would like the characters to meet the High Priest of the Moon. The High Priest of the Moon is my pin. So I drop this pin into the setting and I say, okay, the High Priest of the Moon is a big deal. Probably needs a temple, right? Okay, needs a temple. So now I'm going to decide some basic stuff about the temple. Well, the temple has servants. The temple exists in a city. The city exists in a context. And I only let the ripples go as far as I care to let them drift. And often, as you build a world, you're going to find that the ripples start to overlap. So the High Priest of the Moon exists in a larger pantheon of the Arcana, which I set initially. And what I think, and this is where I want to kind of come in and talk about the difference between improvising something and coming to the table with things, is that in this question, Ian came to the table with what Burning Wheel would call a situation, right? The situation is very important because it is your creative compass as the game master. So my situation for Court of Swords was an East Asian setting built on the themes of fate, the tarot, and choice, drawing imagery from the tarot with inspiration from a couple of other games and stories that I like. That was my situation. I brought that to the table and I said, in this context, here is the game I am interested in running. So what Ian is saying is, hi, everybody. We're going to play a game of Dungeon World, and my situation, the thing I'm bringing to the table, the seed that I would like to plant, to go back to that metaphor, the pin I would like to drop on our blank map, right? The pin I would like to drop is a Conan-esque city, right? And in that city, I am interested in something called the Tower of the Large Gray Mammal. Let's work together to figure out what that looks like, right? And then you offer pins to your players. So offering a pin in this case would be, where in the city of the large gray mammal did you learn your magic, wizard? And the wizard says, oh, great, I get to decide something about the city. Because in answering that, and you're going to see this with more traditional style players, they will look at you and they will say, what are my options? Like if I say to somebody, all right, everyone, we're playing a game set in the Forgotten Realms. Cleric, what god do you worship? A traditional player, a player used to playing D&D, games like it, will say, can I see the list? But in Dungeon World, you're offering them a pin to drop in the map. Because the pin to drop in the map is, well, I learned it in the streets. I use gutter magic. It is the magic of the city. It is I draw power from the ley lines of back alleys and underground cellars, secret meetings of the cloaked eye. Right? Immediately, you have just colored the setting using the tools that the GM has given you. Right? Now, the thing is, as a game master, you have to be prepared. If you're willing to give them that pin and let them drop it on the map, you have to be willing to let it land where it lands and to negotiate that. So if a player says that and you are like, oh, I was really hoping that you would say that you learned at one of the 16 colleges of magic, you can't do that. You have to reframe your question. Right? You shouldn't say, where in the city of the large gray mammal did you learn your magic? If you already have an answer in mind, constrain what the players can give you back. Say to them instead, which of the 16 colleges did you attend? Was it one of the high colleges? One of the low colleges? Were you given a scholarship? Were you born into a lineage of magic? The more specific you are, the more constraints you give to them to reply with their answers. Now, I refer to this creative control in Dungeon World as a dial. And admittedly, you can use these tools in any role-playing game. You don't need to just stick to doing this in Dungeon World. You can do it in D&D, you can do it in Pathfinder, you can do it wherever you like, because all it's doing is adjusting who has narrative control over what. So on the traditional end, and this is fresh in mind because I just described this to Jesse when we were talking about his upcoming Christmas Dungeon World. So there's a dial in Dungeon World as a game master, and on one end of the dial is the traditional structures of narrative in an RPG, right? The game master is responsible for everything in the world except what the player characters do and say. Sometimes The GM, depending on the game, is responsible for what the characters feel. That's something to work out, right? This is a question that I've debated with people a lot. Is it the GM's responsibility to say, you feel angry, you feel sad, right? Or is it simply the GM's job to say, here is the world in front of you. What are you going to do? How do you feel and what do you think? Right? That's part of that early dial. But basically the idea is that if I'm the game master, I get to tell you what the world is about and what's going on in it, and then you tell me what you do and how you respond. Now, as you turn that dial away from that narrative, the players get more and more control, and the GM has, I don't want to say less and less control, but a broader control. So you give the players more and more control over certain things. Maybe you give them control over stuff that's directly related to just their character, right? Now you can tell me, who are your character's friends? Who's your character's family? Where did your character come from, right? You can choose from a list. Tell me more about the world in these very specific constrained ways. But as you get further and further to the other end of the dial is that everyone basically just gets to say whatever they want, and the GM is the one prompting that, right? The GM is going to say, this is the information I am curious about right now, but at any given time, a player could say, oh, I think this is true of this city, right? I think this is true of elves. I think this is true of this. And it's often codified by a phrase, right? It's often like, would it be okay if, or does it make sense if, or there's this idea of asking the GM, not for permission, but saying, I think this would be a cool thing. And you see this a lot if you've ever watched me play with Mark Holmes, or if you've watched me play with Jerry from Penny Arcade. Jerry is great at this, where he will step in as a player and say, I think it would be cool if this thing was happening. Is that okay? Like, do we like that? Mark does a bit of this too, but I think Jerry is more aggressive about it, so it's a little easier. So for you, Ian, to answer your question about asking questions, decide where you want that dial to sit, and then ask questions that are appropriate to filling in the things that you need from them, right? Constrain your questions. If something is not Conan-esque, and that's the setting that you have in mind, ask them a question that they will be able to answer in a Conan-esque way, right? You know what your setting feels like in your heart, and so you want to give them an example to work from. The broader the question, the more opportunity they have to change your vision, right? Like if I say to my players in Court of Swords, what is the name of this bridge? I am allowing them to name the bridge whatever they want, right? But if I say instead, which god is this bridge sacred to? I am getting some specific constrained information from them. As far as where and when you ask the questions, I ask questions of players whenever I do not know the answer, I do not have an answer, or I just don't care. Because that's a weird place to be when you're a GM, when a player asks you a question and you just don't give a shit about the answer, but clearly, because they asked, they do. Right? If somebody asks me, how many crumbles of rain does the Snake Weather Valley get? I'm going to say, I don't fucking care. You tell me. Because players don't ask questions for no reason. They ask questions to clarify what's going on in their head, in their fiction. They ask because they want to know how to narrate their character, right? And they ask because they want to build the world. So often when a player asks you something, you can turn it back on them. You can say, that's not part of I don't care about that. It's unimportant to me. But because you're asking, it's important to you and thus important to the group. In the same way that the Tower of the Large Gray Mammal is important to me, right? It's one of my things, my touchstones. It's my pin in the map. So there isn't like a codified place. In Dungeon World, technically, the rules say you ask a question whenever you're making a move. Like if you want to make a move, one of your moves can be just turn the thing back on them. Ask them a question, clarify, understand, right? But you can do it anytime you want. And you can do it in any game you want. And you can ask questions whenever you just don't have an answer ready. And then you learn to constrain your questions. You learn to ask the right kinds of questions to guide them to the setting that you want. Right? And it's about collaboration. It isn't about like leading them by the nose, right? This isn't about asking questions that are like, when did you stop burning down churches? It's about saying, in what ways does your religion wage war against the others? Right? Like, it's about constraining the player's answers in a way that will encourage them to work within your creative direction. And I've talked about this a ton of times before. The GM in most games is the creative director. It's their job to drive the vision. And when it comes to fronts, and I understand, and I've said this more than once, when it comes to fronts, I understand that they're a bit confusing. And I now, after years of experience using them in both Dungeon World and in Dungeons and Dragons and other games, fronts are an excellent technology that I explained poorly, and I will happily take credit for this one because I think I wrote most of this chapter. I didn't explain them the way that I would like to, and I would definitely rewrite them to explain them differently if we did that again. But basically, a front is just a series of bad things that will happen if the players don't get involved. That's it. It's a series of bad things that will happen, and they are structured around usually an antagonist. That antagonist might be an evil wizard. It might be a plague. It might be an environmental disaster. It might be whatever. It's whatever is the threat in the world. It might be the alien elves from another dimension. It might be the wizard that is threatening your world. Every D&D game has a million of these. And the reason we divided them into campaign fronts and adventure fronts is that usually a single adventure has one core front, but your campaign might have many. So if you were, for example, sitting down with a group of D&D players and you said, okay, we're playing Dungeons and Dragons. There are 3 adventures you can choose from, right? There are 3 different adventures you can choose from, but whichever 2 adventures you don't choose, they are going to progress and change. So you can go to the Palace of the Silver Princess. We can do the cave in which the 2 wizard lovers live, or we can do the Cult of the Reptile God. And whichever 2 you don't choose, those fronts are going to continue to advance. And then when you deal with them later, they will be more advanced and more difficult. So what you can do with fronts is just sit down and write down what you think the antagonism in your setting looks like. And that's it. You just write them down and you say, okay, here's the bad guy. Here is what the bad guy wants, and here are the 5 steps or 10 steps or however many you feel like writing to get them there. And that way, when the players step in, you can look and say, all right, the first 3 steps of the front have been completed. The last 4 have not. You jump in and, Count Gorthang has retrieved the crown of feathers and has ascended Mount Durbrand and has not yet sat upon the Ebon throne. However, while all that's going on, the wizard, Filibuster, has begun his research into undeath. And we know that if we follow him along, eventually he will become a terrible demi-lich, but that will take a lot of time, right? Filibuster's got 18 more steps before he gets there. So it's basically just a way to measure that world as it continues from the beginning of a bad time to the end. And the reason why these are bad things, why you don't have like good fronts, is because they're fronts. You're fighting them. You are combating these. And you need to stop them because when they get to the end, bad things will happen. And so what I think is cool about using fronts as a technology is that they allow you to think about the world as a moving machine. Too many adventures, too many worlds are like, here it is static and flat. And when the players show up, this exact thing happens. It is scripted events. It's like one of those haunted houses where they wait for the visitors to arrive, and then suddenly, here we go. Now we're going to kick into this scene. Instead, fronts continue. The werewolf room will do its werewolf thing, and the vampire room will do its vampire thing. And whichever you choose, you're going to get to see it in motion. So the thing about fronts is that there's no like clear, like do this, check this box, move on to this thing. There's no flow chart for processing fronts. It's just a way to spin plates and to keep the world moving in a way that puts the pressure on the players. And so I think that's an ostensible technology that Dungeon World has that you can use elsewhere. And I do, right? If you've ever watched any of my Court of Swords prep, that is how I do it, because I like worlds that move along. So Ian, I hope that helped answer your fairly sizable question. And for folks who are interested in using fronts or asking more questions in whatever role-playing game you're playing, I hope that it provided you with a little bit of additional information. Our second question is much, much shorter, but also like a lot looser in terms of how we're going to answer it. Let's see what JC has to ask.
Hey, Adam. My question to you is, what are the elements that make for a satisfying campaign ending? Specifically, I'm trying to plan a campaign for a mid-level Dungeons & Dragons group. Thanks.
Well, my Lord and Savior Jesus Christ, the elements that make for a satisfying campaign ending really depend on the campaign. And of course, depend on the game, right? Dungeons & Dragons doesn't really have an end game. Certainly not in the way that, like, Blades does. Apocalypse World and Dungeon World both state flat out, you should probably only play 10 to 12 sessions. You can kind of feel mechanically when those games are coming to a close. Some games have retirement mechanics, but most games of Dungeons & Dragons end with either a TPK no one wants to rebuild from, or the human level equivalent of a TPK, which is to say a scheduling snafu from which no one can escape, right? In Dungeons & Dragons, the loop is get more gold to spend on equipment that makes you better at killing monsters so you can get experience, so that you can gain levels, so you can become better at getting gold and gear to make you more efficient at killing monsters, so that you may kill more monsters to gain more experience, to become better at it, etc., 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 until eventually the game dies of old age. In a lot of ways, actually, Dungeons & Dragons is very reflective of the sort of modern Western capitalist lifestyle, which, as I say it, makes me sound like a Soviet philosopher. The idea of, like, you buy a car so that you can drive to your job, so that you can make money, so that you can pay off your car, which you can use to drive to your job, to make money, so you can pay for that car, which of course you bought to drive to your job, etc., right? So there just isn't a lot of that stuff in Dungeons and Dragons. There's no end game in the same way that in real life there isn't really an end game except for maybe retirement. But in a D&D game, you're meant to just get to level 20, and then the game says, well, we can't guide you any further. You have reached the scope of which our game allows. Earlier versions of D&D simply continue to add levels on top of that to say, well, you're a god now, and you can become a god and fight other gods until you're level 50, and then now you're really done. But there's never been a supplement that I've ever seen that says the game ends and your characters create a lasting legacy in the campaign setting, which you can now use to build on another game. What's ironic is that there's no D&D legacy game, right? We have no version of D&D, or at least haven't. Now, I will say, there's a new Free Lagan game that just came out, and it's their open world sandbox RPG. I'm sure some of you kickstarted it. It's a big box set, and the map comes with stickers. And as you discover things in your home campaign, you put the stickers on the map. Forbidden Lands, that's what it's called. Thank you. And you put these stickers on the map, and there is a degree of that legacy-style gameplay to it, which I think is quite cool. But D&D, by default, doesn't really do that, because it's more about the grind and the climb than it is about the destination. So I think, to go back to the core premise of your question here, JC, what makes for a satisfying campaign ending is closure, right? Closure makes for a satisfying campaign ending. I think the idea of a core arc, usually in these kinds of fiction, a core arc's defined by the antagonism in the campaign, right? Defined by defeating the bad guy. This is why the big bad end boss guy is a trope in Dungeons and Dragons, because whether it's Sauron or Darth Vader or whomever, there's always this bad guy that keeps getting in our way, and we need to stop the bad guy. And that is the most common ending, is we have done it. We have arrived in the Tomb of Annihilation. We have slain the end boss, and we have freed the world from the death curse, or whatever, right? We've killed Tiamat. We have freed Hamlet from the influence of the cult. Like there's always this kind of like, defeat the bad guy who's causing the problem and in the front. And that's the simplest version. That's the simplest version of an ending, right? Defeating the adversary. Now, that may not provide closure for individual characters. So that's where you look at your, again, and I'm going on the most baseline kind of hero's journey, like derivative fantasy adventure of all time. Like we're not fucking Kafka over here. We're not fucking Kafka either, because he probably wouldn't be into that. But it's about driving a core plot through the game based on defeating an adversary, overcoming an obstacle, preventing calamity, the kinds of shit that heroic fiction loves, getting revenge, whatever, right? The plot of kill the orcs, slay the orcs, destroy the orcs, right? It's simple. However, you can improve or expand on this with character background, right? Because yes, it's satisfying to defeat evil, but the reason why defeating Darth Vader was cool and awesome was that it was done by Luke Skywalker, right? It's not just anybody. And this can be problematic in Dungeons and Dragons because with D&D, Luke might not have made it past level 3, right? Where you're like, cool, here's my character. He's Luke Skywalker. He's going to be a Jedi, and I'm super excited. And he's, I got shot by a stormtrooper. He's dead. Okay. So anyway, so often in this sort of gameplay, you end up with an adversary that sticks around and people who oppose that adversary that do not, at least for the first little while. Yeah. And that can happen. So what I think you need to do is be aware of kind of the main adversarial stuff in the game. A good adversary, a good villain is the most important, I think, in this kind of fiction, the most important thing. The secondary thing is other stuff to care about, right? Things in the world that you can get closure on, whether this is backstory. So if a player says, my character also has this other specific reason, right? I'm not here just for Darth Vader. I want to loot the Imperial Vault, right? Yes, hooray, great. We all defeated the evil and the world will continue to exist, but mainly I was here to loot the Imperial Vault. Good job on killing Darth Vader. Right. The wizard might want a secret uncovered. The cleric may want to atone for a past sin. The characters all have particular goals that drive them, and asking about these goals at the beginning will make the ending more satisfying. If you understand why the characters want what they want, and again, Dungeons and Dragons does not give even 1/10 of a shit about why you want to do those things. There are bits and pieces in the character sheet that might imply what they're up to, but mainly things like bonds and drive and whatever they call them, those are there to get inspiration, to drive you to roleplay moment to moment, but they can also be hints as to why you are questing. But I would go into that deeper. I would understand the characters from the beginning about why they're in this adventure and what for them personally they need closure on. Why are you driving towards the ending of this thing? And in the end, you got to recognize that it's not about giving everybody everything that they want, right? And some stories end in misery. And if you're playing in a campaign that I'm running, probably what you get is a version of what you desired. If you want, for me, I end character arcs way more often than I end campaign arcs. And so with character arcs, I want to get players to a point where their character realizes they no longer want what they originally thought they did, or they get what they want, but it's somehow more complicated or more difficult or different than they expected. I have always wanted to be a dragon, right? This idea of giving characters the opportunity to say, I mean, for me, one of these big satisfying endings is Mr. Sicarian, right? Jeff spent all of Swansong, basically, driving for revenge, and I gave it to him, and it wasn't what he expected. It wasn't exactly what he thought it would be. So I don't think a satisfying ending has to just be hand jobs for everybody, right? An ending can be closure. It can be, I no longer need what I thought I needed. I am a new character. I am a new person. I have lost what I thought I needed most. I have gained something new. But it can be, right? And what I'll often do is I'll give a satisfying, straightforward ending to the main plot, right? But complicated or different endings for each character that might not be so straightforward, right? We all defeated the bad guy, but at what cost? I don't think Dungeons & Dragons is going to help you much here, but I think what you can do is you can talk to your players. You can say, when you make your characters, what kinds of things do they want? And check in as you go, right? It's not about setting up the pins at the beginning and then knocking them down at the end. It's about constantly checking in about the direction of the game, right? Do you still want these things? And again, it's not really fair to expect anything from Dungeons & Dragons, right? If you look at a game like Torchbearer or Burning Wheel, if you look at Fiasco, there are games that care about coming to a conclusion, or at the very least about what the characters have to say about their own story. There's nothing unsatisfying for me about playing a Burning Wheel character because you're constantly in control of what's going on in your life. You have multiple endings for your character as you go. Dungeons & Dragons will not help you. So what you have to do is, as players, talk about that. Like, where is this character going? Where is the campaign going? But my core advice when you're starting a game and you're making plans, antagonist. There's a way earlier episode where I talk in depth about making good antagonists. So check that out. It's in the 20s, I think, episodes of Office Hours. But make a strong antagonist and then learn why the characters are opposing them. And that will draw you to a satisfying ending. D&D won't help, so just do the work as a person. That is my thought. That is my thought on the matter. It's complicated, right? I've said this 100 times. Starting a thing is easy. Continuing a thing is hard, but ending a thing well is nearly impossible. And I am most proud of the endings of character arcs and the endings of shows that I have done more than anything else, because it's so hard to do. So if you want to look at how I end things, I would suggest taking a look at the conclusion of Nebula Jazz. Take a look at the conclusion of Swansong. Both of them. Take a look at the conclusion of Mirror Shades. All of those feel to me like solid endings for characters and for arcs. And if you want to look at character endings, Court of Swords is full of them, both abrupt and intentional. I will say this, though, as a sort of a final note for JC here. As a final note, if you're looking for a fun way to let the players contribute to the endings, here's what you can do. I call it the epilogue. So the epilogue is when you conclude your bit, And then you say, all right, everybody, we're going to go around the table, and I want you to give me a vignette. Tell me a little story about where we see your character after this. How long has it been? Where are they? What are they doing? Use this as an opportunity to paint us a picture of their life after this adventure, right? Where are they now? What did they do? And this is straight up just Tolkien ripoff style, right? Fiasco does this in a constrained way, the Fiasco RPG, but like Tolkien did this and did it way too long and way too hard, right? This is the Return of the King is over, Sauron is defeated, and here's 500 more pages about, I don't know, the Shire and going to Rivendell, and there's a lot. So don't do that. But give each of your players an opportunity to say, all right, so you defeated evil, what happened? And they might be like, I return home. We see us opening. We open the door to to my home, and I walk in and I look around. I take off my muddy cloak and I hang it on the peg, and something is missing. I've been away too long. My heart has changed. I am a creature of the road now. This home holds no warmth for me. And so the last thing we see is me picking up my sword belt, grabbing my cloak, and shutting the door for the last time on my old familiar home. The home I worked so hard to save. I turn my back on it, and I return to a life of danger. Right? Like this idea, like, and that's such a good, giving the players, like, give us your ending. What happens to you? And I think that the thing about epilogues is that, especially if you're done with a campaign, giving the players freedom not to have to roll dice, not to have to do any of that shit, but just to be like, I get to say what happens now based on everything we've seen in the game. And I think that's really fun. And you can do this even for people who died heroically, right? Like, describe to us where your character is built, is buried, right? Describe the mausoleum built for you. Describe the statue they erected in your hometown. Are you regaled as a hero, or are you forgotten? Is your story misinterpreted, right? And do people think of you as a villain, right? What happens to your memory? It's not about what happens to the character. It's about the character's legacy. And don't stop making notes when this happens, because this shit is how you start new campaigns, right? Because then if somebody became a god by defeating the King of Death, they might have worshipers in the next campaign. This is how you get legs out of this stuff. This is how campaigns last for 30 years, right? Because you're playing in the same world and you have this narrative flow, but it's not always the same characters. Yeah, I like epilogues. I like that stuff. I think it's a really powerful way to bring the conclusion into the group space, right? After the big climactic ending, you're taking off your GM crown and you're setting it aside, or putting it in the middle of the table, and everyone gets to lay a hand on it, and they get to GM their own moment. And this works really well with people who are familiar with Fiasco or Microscope games that kind of like let people play these things, but you can also use this to start a campaign, right? What is new now? How have things changed? I love that stuff. I can't wait I want to do like a whole epilogue episode when we finally end Court of Swords, like in another 100 episodes or whatever. I'm going to go, all right, let's go back and we'll revisit all the characters who are still alive. What do we see? Talk about that. Let's talk about the world. What does our conclusion look like? And I think it's a really nice, like, cool down. It's a denouement, right? So yeah, hopefully that helps. All of that advice should work for any campaign of any system, but pay attention to whether the game does anything for you or not, and then determine kind of how you want to tell that ending together. All right, our third question comes to us from Tyler.
I'm about to start running Dragon Heist with some friends in the near future, but I'm having a difficult time in prepping as I wanted to convert Dragon Heist from the Waterdeep setting to a different setting altogether. So I was wondering, Do you have any advice on converting pre-made adventures to a different setting? Thank you, and have a wonderful day.
So I think this is a pretty common question, right? Or conundrum at the very least. Like, how do we take something that is very much built for a specific world and apply it to a different one, right? Now, some adventures like Tomb of Annihilation have little things at the beginning that say, if you are setting this somewhere that is not the Forgotten Realms, here's where you could jam this jungle, right? Here's where you could put Chult. You could say this is going to be set in someplace in Greyhawk, or we're playing in a campaign setting in Eberron. This is where the Tomb of Annihilation could be in Eberron. But I think that with, especially now, this is very challenging because adventures are written with a specific context in mind, especially Dragon Heist, right? Dragon Heist is called, the full title of the adventure is Waterdeep Dragon Heist, right? So everything about it is Waterdeepian. It's very, very difficult to peel away the poetry layer because it's a very thick layer, right? It's more like pulling teeth. And I'm not saying you can't do it, and we'll talk about how we would. But the reason for this, again, going back to kind of what we talked about in the first question, the way that adventures used to be, you wouldn't get campaign settings, right? You wouldn't get campaign settings. There wouldn't be the first product wouldn't be a whole world guide to Greyhawk. You would get 10 or 15 adventures, each set in a different part of Greyhawk, and you would get to put Greyhawk together in your head, right? They were designed to be dropped in, to be like, here is the village from Against the Cult of the Reptile God. What was it called? Hoken? It had a really terrible name. And you would place it anywhere in your world, or you would build up Greyhawk around Orlane. Orlane is the name of that village. So you would build up the world around it. It would be a pin, right? The adventure would be a pin that you would drop in to say, here is Orlane. Orlane is on a river. It is in the mountains. There are some fields, and I will put it here. And I built my most satisfying experience with this style of world building came from Dungeon Crawl Classics. So with Dungeon Crawl Classics, there's no campaign setting, but all of the adventures are set in the same world. And we started with the level 0 adventure. We traveled a little ways. We did a level 1 adventure. Boom, now I have 2 pins on the map. They ripple out a little bit. We travel a little further. We place another pin. That ripples out. We understand, oh shit, the cult from the 3rd adventure probably is the same thing that the necromancer worshipped in the 1st adventure. So now there's this death god, which is probably the same death god in the level 5 adventure we're going to do in 3 months. So you start to build up these connections between adventures, and there's no campaign setting. Yeah, they're landmarks. Exactly. Places that you can see in the distance, but that may not have a set place in your map until you arrive there, until you place it yourself. The problem is that what you're trying to do is take a very, very specific thing and apply it to a world where it doesn't belong, right? Now, I think the two main things here are location and population, in Dragon Heist particularly, right? Location, population. Plot doesn't matter, because the plot of Dragon Heist is corrupt politician steals a bunch of money, bad guys find out about the money being hidden somewhere, corrupt politician gets kicked out of town, bad guys try to get the money, PCs try to stop it, right? That's the plot. You could do that shit anywhere. Anywhere. You could set it in Sigil. You could set it in New York City. You could set it any goddamn place you want to set it. That doesn't matter. The plot is the easiest part. It's location and population that becomes the problem. So location in this case is Waterdeep, right? And Waterdeep is a big city. Okay, plenty of those in fantasy, right? Big city. But it's a big city with some specific locations that matter, right? It matters where the players go. It matters that there is a big tavern where adventurers hang out. It matters that there is a noble district. It matters there is a dock. It matters that there are enormous statues. This stuff, location is easier than population to change because all you got to do is just find replacements. Now, if you are converting your setting and Waterdeep together, no problem, because you get to just make up your own shit, right? If you're like, all right, we're going to set this in the fantasy kingdom of Airshallow, and Airshallow is the greatest city in the world of the unremembered lands. It is a city ruled by a council of lord. Like, you get to make up your own stuff, so you just fill in. So when you need a location, you can create one. You're really just filing off the serial numbers and replacing it with your own shit, right? So the Yawning Portal becomes whatever your personal hub for adventurers is. That's easy. Now, if you're trying to jam an adventure like Waterdeep Dragon Heist into an existing setting and you don't want to really fuck up that setting, well, you're going to have to jam some square pegs into some round holes. If you're setting this in the city of Uruk, in the blasted deserts of Dark Sun, it's a very different place. You're not likely to find a big tavern like the Yawning Portal. There probably won't be a nobles district in the same way. And this is where we start to cross over into population, because what it is the unique character of the thing and how important that is to the setting, right? And we've talked about this lots of times before in terms of how do you rip off existing stuff, right? If you love, I don't know, Wolverine, how do you make a character that is Wolverine-esque without straight up just being like, he's from Fantasy Canada, he loves beer, and he has claws for hands, and he's a big, hairy, angry man, right? A little hairy, angry man. But how do you do that without... So you have to boil the setting down, right? You have to understand what about Waterdeep and its locations and people matter to the adventure, right? What matters about the factions, right? Does your setting have something that is analogous or close enough to the Zentarim or the Brigandairth or the Xanathar's Guild or the Castellanters that you can use them similarly, right? What is the essence of the Zentarim in this adventure, and what in your world fits that, right? If you're running, for example, let's say you're running Dragon Heist in Ravnica, right? Now, in Ravnica, you could very easily replace the Castellanters with some Orzhov bankers. No problem. The Xanathar's Guild, they could be a Gruul clan, right? Or they could be a Rakdos clan. You could replace the Brigandairth with some Dimir, right? These things are not too hard to find analogies to, because when it really comes down to it, we only have so many tropes to work with. I could run Waterdeep Dragon Heist in Farverona pretty easy, right? Like, just off the top of my head. Because I understand the setting and I understand the material. So the idea here is to take what matters about the locations and the populations and change them into what's in your setting that is the closest analogy, right? What is the thing that is the most like that? And if your setting is pretty similar to the Forgotten Realms, yeah, just go ahead and just like clear off the names and be like, oh yeah, like these drow criminals are the same as my dark elf criminals, right? The Brigandairth are a lot like this anti-Matka Devkarin Splinter Golgari group. They're pretty much the same thing already. Done. No problem. I would have a much harder time running Waterdeep Dragon Heist in Court of Swords, because Court of Swords is so aggressively and intentionally different from the Forgotten Realms. So it's about boiling it down, right? Look at all of the stuff in your adventure, look at all the locations and the characters, and figure out what matters about them. Like, does it matter in Dragon Heist that Xanathar is a beholder? Not really, right? Does it matter why what the deal is with the Castellaners, like why they want the money? No, I mean, they're just like weird rich nobles, right? They're pretty standard creepy nobles. So that's fairly easy to replace. And you're gonna get a really good understanding, and I think this is a great experience. You get a good understanding of the adventure when you do this. You're going to understand Dragon Heist a lot better than you did when you first just read through it, because you have to very carefully pick apart each element and decide, what is this going to be in my world, right? And again, if you are creating the world yourself, anything that's missing, you can create, right? If you need a god of machines for the section about Gond, and the Temple of Wandering Hands, or whatever it's called, go ahead and make it, right? Create that in your world. But you might come to a point where you're like, oh, there's just no connection. There's no analogy, and I do not want there to be one. In which case, you probably don't have space for this adventure, and you might want to grab another one. Thankfully, there are so many good adventures. There's so many good adventures out there. There's tons. Look at AD&D adventures. Look at basic D&D adventures. There is a shit ton of good adventures out there that you can much more easily convert to your own setting. Ultimately, I would say that the best setting, the best system for running Dragon Heist isn't even 5th edition D&D to begin with. It's Blades in the Dark. Dragon Heist is a Blades adventure. It's like so obviously a Blades adventure. And in Blades, you don't even have to pick one adversary. Everyone can be going after the gold at the same time. So, it's about catching the spirit of the adventure. Dragon Heist is a funny one because it's so setting specific, but not a very D&D type of adventure. So you gotta do a lot of work. However, if you like Dragon Heist, if you are curious about the game's material and why it is the way that it is a great experience to dig through an adventure and figure out, like, oh, the reason this NPC is here is so the characters have someone more expert to rely on when they need help. It's not just a funny joke. They live within a block of a private investigator so they can go to that person for assistance. Like, of course, that's why they're there. This process of deconstructing an adventure is much easier when the adventure is written really well and the inspirations within it and the reason things are in it matter. Worse written adventures are harder and harder to convert. So I don't know. I how difficult it's going to be, that's going to be up to you and the setting that you're playing in and how much you want to do work. But no matter what happens, you're going to understand Dragon Heist probably better than anybody else who just played it or ran it or read it, right? You're going to have to pick it apart in the same way that taking an inspiration from anything and converting it into a role-playing game is that same process. So, yeah. Cool. Well, thank you for your question, Tyler. And thank you, JC and Ian, for your questions. I hope that they've been answered adequately so as to assist you. And if you are neither JC nor Ian nor Tyler, I hope that those folks' questions were helpful for you in your own home games. So as always, Office Hours remains a write-in GM advice show. If you have questions, if you have thoughts, the more specific, the better. Go ahead and pop over to my website, www.adam-koble.com. Click on the Office Hours link, submit your question, and let me know what's got under your skin as a game master. What game are you playing? Why is it messing with you? let me know. I will try to help you. I always love reading the questions and answering them in time. So thanks for coming, everybody. This has been episode number 76. We will see you next time for more office hours.